Peter's work. Now, he is well known for coming in this room and winding us up about critical discourse analysis. The only thing wrong with critical discourse analysis is that it isn't critical, etc. But that's not quite his topic, I don't think, today. The papers that he's been working on recently undermine our God, Vygotsky, who is the fundament of activity theory for most of us. And in the Marxist position, we see Vygotsky as the sort of first Marxist psychologist. And Peter says, well, he wanted to be a Marxist psychologist, and he says in his paper that was he knew that there needed to be a Marxist psychology, a social psychology, but the tools that he was working with at the time, particularly reflexology, Pavlov, and so on, but also workers at the time such as Janet, how do I pronounce that? Janet, French, yeah. Were inadequate to the task, and there were consequences in Vygotsky's legacy of that, and that's what he's been working on recently, and I think there's a book coming on its way. But and this is so I want to start with Vygotsky, and then we'll go on to Leontiev and tear him apart.
But you can continue with Vygotsky, because I am...
Okay, you're with this story. and we'll come to Perivani, which is part of Vygotsky's legacy. So I want to stir Peter up a bit. Where exactly are the flaws in Vygotsky's legacy that we haven't overcome in building a Marxist psychological tradition? He points towards, in one of his papers, I went looking, he points towards Marx's views on psychology and probably ethnography and anthropology in the German ideology, but he doesn't really yet. He hasn't really got to grips in the papers that I've read with exactly where. So that's where I wanted to start.
All right, thank you.
If you could take it, first of all, correct my
thank you
characterization.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Thank you, and hello to everybody. Well, this is a very complex issue, which I'll try to oversimplify usefully. On the one hand, there's probably no theory of psychology that is so dependent on ideas about language and communication as Vygotsky's psychology. The key concepts in Vygotsky are in effect to do with either signs, words, word meaning, speech, meaning versus sense, and so on. So you've got a network, an evolving network of concepts about language and communication. These actually underpin the whole theoretical architecture of Vygotsky's psychology. So the first question that I began to ask was, what are these ideas? Where did Vygotsky get these ideas about language and communication from? What kind of intellectual tradition are these ideas about language and communication rooted in? Because these ideas don't come from nowhere. These are very specific traditions in the history of Western thought about language and communication. And Vygotsky is quite firmly in some of the key dominant traditions of Western thinking about language and communication. And in that sense, his work is vulnerable to all the critical points that Western tradition of language and communication is vulnerable to. And so my first approach was to look very hard at what concepts are being employed, how these are being employed to justify and to ground a particular view of the human mind. I'll come back to that in a bit, but there are two, I think, main ways in which particular aspects of the tradition are employed which are problematic. And I'll perhaps come back to that a little bit if I may. But to answer more squarely your other point about Marx, where would you expect a Marxist psychology to start? Where would you begin to develop some kind of psychological theory that you thought was consonant with a Marxist approach? Where would you start? Well, of course, Marx himself referred to, for example, industry. The history of industry, he says, is the open book of psychology. So it might have been an idea, for example, to consider how people collectively concert their efforts together for collaborative work. For example, it might have taken us to a look at real-time collaborative activity, how such activity is organised, how people learn to participate in such activities, how such activities are overthrown, how they are developed. In other words, it might have led us to consider how human labour, to use Marx's terms, is actually organised and the psychological implications of understanding that kind of practice. So I will now summarise for you what Vygotsky contributed to that particular area. Would you like me to summarise it again?
I thought you were going to say. I thought you were going to say nothing.
In other words, Vygotsky's coming at it from a quite different perspective. Let me just quote something which I think is a very interesting take on Vygotsky's approach. Now, this is incidentally from a piece of work by Leontiev. I think it's called something like, On Vygotsky's Creative Development. That's what it's called. Leontiev is talking about the foundations of a Marxist psychology. And he says, a Marxist psychology must begin with a psychological analysis of the practical labour activity of humans on the basis of Marxist positions. That's what he says. And then he says, however, Vygotsky decided to begin his analysis of the mental processes of humans with what he calls an analogy, namely the mediation of the labour process by tools. So Leontiev at this point doesn't question whether substituting for an actual study of labour activity with an analogy between signs and tools is a valid move, but there you can see the problem. That we actually start in Vygotsky not with a sort of an open-minded analysis of labour activity. We don't start with looking at how people actually organise their work and the psychological capacities that they must exercise and develop in that work. We start out with an analogy between tools and symbols. Now there's problems there right from the beginning, because although Vygotsky was a literate Marxist, and he understood and obviously realised and expressed the fact that human mental capacities are part and parcel of our actual productive life, socially conditioned, socially determined, and so on. That view, in coming out, as it were, in being developed, got stuck on two main points that were characteristic of the so-called Soviet Marxism of the day. So, partly in answer to your question, I would say that the overriding intellectual background of Vygotsky's work was the taken for granted assumptions of a so-called Soviet Marxist tradition, What were those two main sticking points? A commitment to Pavlovian reflexology. That was basically taken for granted in educated Bolshevik circles as the way to go. So Vygotsky tried to translate Marx's pronouncements about human labour as being goal-directed, tried to translate Marx's thinking about human consciousness and its importance to human existence. He tried to translate it into reflex terms. And the way to do that was to develop a notion of the sign, which was basically a kind of a stimulus. So that conscious voluntary activity in humans was to be explained by us purposefully putting into our stream of activity signs that would act in a Pavlovian stimulus response fashion. So the first attempt was to try and work in a Pavlovian conception and translate that Marxian view into a Pavlovian conception. The second stream, if you like, which comes on later in Vygotsky, there's an interesting piece where Vygotsky says, we forgot meaning. So the earlier work was very much tied up with what I call a causal mechanical type view of a sign, which is characteristic of a reflexological approach. The second approach is one which I call abstract scholastic. Here is where meaning and concepts are envisaged as reflections or representations of reality. That is a very, very firmly established tradition in the Western language philosophical position. In other words, he sees the development of thought, and thought as it were controlling the lower psychological formations, as based on increasingly abstract generalizations. Now the problem with that view of meaning and concepts as generalizations of the world is that it does not see the instrumentality of meaning and concepts. It doesn't see the fact that these forms of communication are socially established, collectively organized. It simply sees a relationship between the concept and the world. So there are virtually no concrete analyses of social interaction at all in Vygotsky. The work on concepts, the work on meaning is limited to looking at how experimental concepts develop, concepts seen as higher and higher types of generalization. The entire social fabric, the entire collectively organized practices in which people develop concepts, in which they communicate with one another, and in which they develop those psychological capacities, all of that is missing, virtually. If somebody can name me some sociological concepts in Vygotsky, I'd be happy to look at it. There are a few. Okay, so overall, in answer to your question, Vygotsky tried to put these insights of Marx into practice in a, I don't want to be sound too horrible about the whole thing. I mean, Vygotsky was brilliant, and I don't want to denigrate that tradition, but in trying to translate Marx's views, I think, into a psychological tradition, he got caught on those two things. That problem is there right at the heart of his theory, in the distinction between natural and cultural, or lower and higher psychological functions. That distinction is essentially based on accepting a Pavlovian foundation.
And before sort of moving on, because I think that's been really helpful, but something that I think might connect with Fernando. Do you see the problem with Pavlov as being, where is the subject? I mean, so what you're saying is that the psyche is responsive to stimulus, and who is the subject of that stimulus? Some bloody psychiatrist or psychologist with a pen and paper.
Well, yeah, in effect, Pavlov was the subject.
Yes, and the stimulus, and so a Marxist position would have the labourer as the subject.
It's not so much that, it's a completely mechanical conception of it. In other words, it's the attempt to see psychology
as
a mechanism.
It's a causative
as a mechanism
rather than a dialectical.
Yeah, and the reflex conception comes from Descartes.
Yeah.
So the Cartesian tradition.
So it's a non-dialectical causative relationship between subject and object. Yes. That's the bit that I wanted, because I think that connects with Fernando a bit. At least my mistaken reading or critique of Fernando. I've warned him what's coming, so he's laughing. So thanks very much. That was really good. I hope that there's some. I hope that will bring you back in later with questions and comments and thoughts about that. But I want to get Perez-Ivany, and because for Fernando, the weaknesses in Vygotsky that bloomed under Leontiev's Stalinist degeneration between the 30s and the 70s, I suppose, is in this sort of functional psychology, and the beauties of Vygotsky are in the Perez-Ivany, where at various stages of Vygotsky's career, and particularly at the end, before he died, where he was talking about the importance of the history of the subject in the meaning that they make of experience. And there's a particular paper of Vygotsky's about the three sort of psychological experiences of children at different levels of maturity in a family. There were three distinct Perez-Ivany or emotional experiences encountered by these three children of their mother's alcoholic abuse, and Vygotsky analyses this very, very nicely in that paper, and it's elsewhere. So this is a whole area that Fernando is interested in and has been writing a lot about. Two things really. First thing is, it begins with a more or less savage attack on Leontiev, this ghastly Stalinist bureaucrat. Even though some of us find some value in Leontiev's work. But the interesting thing is that the work that Engstrom's done in modern cultural historical activity theory uses Leontiev in precisely the way that Fernando wants to develop a more intersubjective world where there are multiple subjects, contradictions between subjects, where subjectivity is a crucial issue, as it is in Perez-Ivany. And so for Engstrom, and Engstrom also, of course, brings in Bakhtin, which you do as well, into this. So one has multiple voices, multiple contradictions within the activity system by these different psychological subjectivities and voices and so on. So it's what I find difficult to cope with is how the Leontiev of Fernando is completely the opposite of the Leontiev. And I must admit, I quote Leontiev as suggesting that an activity system is the ensemble, the whole ensemble of social relations of all the subjects involved in an activity system. And then you get the norms and rules and division of labour and all those interesting contradictions within systems. And so, I mean, that's the sort of background. And then, I suppose, in another sense, I wanted to ask, I think we all see the idea of Perez-Ivany, it's too simplistic what I'm suggesting, but the idea that we all have a cultural history, and that cultural history is in our bodies and in our sites. You know, I think we all accept this. Everybody who works with an activity theory tends to accept this. I think the bit that distinguishes Fernando's current account is that in his account now, the object disappears. So we only have intersubjectivity. But Hegel and Marx began with, always in labour and in general in activity, with a dialectic which begins with the subject and object. Mm-hmm. And without the object, there is no subject. And without the subject, there is no object. Fernando seems to see in places, I don't want to quote and embarrass him, that the object is a material thing that subjects work on. But that not necessarily so in Marx and Hegel. The subject and object are dialectically connected in much more complex ways than that. And the chair is not just a chair because it's a material object, it also has an ideal form, it's a cultural entity. And I know to sit in it because I've been taught to sit in it, you see. So what constitutes that chair is not just its material form, but also its cultural context. And in that sense, I think that if Leontiev, so my question is, if you get rid of the object, I think you end up smuggling objectivity back into the account through your two forms of subjectivity. Does that question make sense?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Makes sense for answering you. I think that we have really a problem because Soviet psychology was a very complex network of authors and trends. For example, no one speak about Miasyshev or Ananiev, which were the first who speak about communication explicitly and the institutional matters in the social period. Really, for me, Vygotsky, and this is clear in my paper from 2011, Vygotsky had many different contradictory moments. Because even when Peter accused, and I agree in this point, to Vygotsky to be Pavlovian, it was only in the very beginning of the Vygotsky work, in pedagogical psychology. But paradoxically, in psychology of art, he has completely another approach to the matter, for example, of imagination, emotions, and no subjectivity. He never spoke explicitly about subjectivity, but about the emotions engagement or all human performance. His foundational ideas is in psychology and art, in the same period in which pedagogical psychology emerged, because we talk about cultural historical psychology, but it is impossible to make an intellectual analysis of this psychology ignoring the different periods of Soviet society in those moments. For example, Soviet psychology characterized for always had one dominant official theory. First was Pavlov, Victor spoke, and Besterev, that was very strong also in that period. But after that began a very behavioral term even in Vygotsky. Even Vygotsky, when entering the Kornilov group, gave a very behavioral term, the matter of internalization of sign only of artificial mediator that changed the character of the stimulus, completely behavioral, you know. And then began the period in which Kornilov was ahead, was the main recognized Marxist psychology, the reactology of Kornilov. After Kornilov replaced Shelpanov in the Institute of Psychology. But in this path appeared Rubinstein, and Rubinstein was a completely different approach. He was centered on consciousness, or on the integration of consciousness and activity. It is impossible to speak about activity without taking into account consciousness, because activity is always engaged with the conscious, and it was very important. Even Rubinstein in the 40s was in the top of Soviet psychology, and then when Lysenko began his campaign about a Marxist genetic, was used by Leontiev and Galperin for make a conspiracy in the Department of Psychology of Lomonosov University. All this is published in Russian, for replace Rubinstein, and then Leontiev go up. But what it is important here is that the last official psychology in Soviet psychology was precisely activity theory. And Leontiev made everything that is possible for him to eliminate Vygotsky. Because if you, for example, read the preface to Psychology of Art, he practically did not recognize nothing to Vygotsky in that work. And if you take one of his last books, that was the integration of 3 papers published in Vaprosi philosophy, you can see that activity, activity, consciousness, and personality, practically Vygotsky was not quoted in any moment. The critique to the cultural historical activity theory began very early. In the 1995, Vladimir Petrovich Zinchenko published in English in one book organized by Welsh a very interesting paper defining the differences between cultural historical psychology attributed to Vygotsky and activity theory. But the fact is that being Vygotsky in life, he never used the term cultural historical. It was introduced in the literature after Vygotsky's death. Then it's very interesting here to listen that you say sociocultural, cultural historical activity theory, but all these terms has different meanings, are not the same. And you mentioned Engelstrom. Really, Engelstrom studied in the United States with Michael Cole. Was when he formed, he used the background of activity theory of Leontiev, and he really invented an approach centered on activity that has a little to do with Leontiev and a little to do with Vygotsky, have nothing to do with Vygotsky. I ashamed because I would like to have Engelstrom here for discussing with him, but Engelstrom does not know that tradition at all. And of course, the term activity is very nice, but Vygotsky using the term was referring to concrete activity with material objects. Even had a very interesting polemic between Menchinskaya, that was a very strong Soviet psychology, and Talissina, one disciple of Leontiev. And Menchinskaya defended, it was in the 1977, that not necessarily the knowledge that learned the child in the school have been mediated by activity with objects. That was the point defended by Talissina. Then the problem is not the object, is what kind of object is Leontiev defended. What kind of object? Concrete, practical objects. Even a very metaphysical position of Leontiev is to explicitly state that the need meet with the object and then appear the motive of activity. But from where come needs? Is intrinsic to the human body, and the object, it is floating in the cultural atmosphere. It is completely paradoxical, this kind of a statement. Then I think that it is the moment to make a revision of the traditional way in which we are working with cultural historical activity, sociocultural, because when words eliminate historical, it is not was a neutral step, it's what an ideological position. And then it is impossible to continue talk about these laws without any discrimination. My critique to Leontiev is that, for me, human mind, it is not the internalization of external operation. It's much more complicated. And Peter mentioned the symbolic. But the symbol, in my opinion, was used in general, even by Vygotsky, in Soviet psychology in a very narrow way. he most spoke about sign, the mediation of sign, but symbol as a complex cultural production and subjectivity recreated and invented by human beings was not a problem of Soviet psychology. You know, about this is the matter of symbolical entered so late in Soviet philosophy, because the symbolical is very subversive. You know, when you keep away from reality and recognize a human capacity to go behind reality, enter in contradiction with a society centered on control and on manipulation. And it is not only a theoretical question, it's a political one.
I have to take advantage of your thirst to break in.
I am drinking water. I'm drinking water.
I promised that we would try and move to the general discussion eventually, and I know you can keep going for another couple of hours if I don't stop you. So I'm hoping that there's plenty of stimulus there for folks. And let's move on to Hanne, who's going to tell us about her work. I've read several of the papers, fascinated by the stories of the cultural mediation, culture in the broadest sense, of children's formation of identity at various stages of their lives and in transition. Tell us more, and we'll come to the cultural historical bit after.
Yeah, because I think you will notice now some kind of a jump. Because when my take on this question for today is to say how to advance the comprehension of psychological phenomena under the guidance of theoretical notions about the cultural and the historical. And I'm not that interested and not that skilled, of course, because lack of interest often go with lack of skill, to make distinctions between Vygotsky, Engström, whether he's right or... I rather turn my eyes to psychology, and the first simple thing to say is that I don't approve of the widespread habits among psychology to point to what they call background factors, because that is a jargon that has grown by itself, so to say, to be the standard way of accounting for both culture and history, to place them as background factors. Because this means to me that historical trends and cultural habits only get defined as influences working upon persons, often according to some kind of statistical logic, and therefore behind their backs, so to say. Still, I claim to be a psychologist. And in this sense, I'm pointing out to you how I, in the subjective sense, present my accountability as a researcher and as a professional. And if you have read the paper that was put up on the website for this event in order to introduce me, you will know that I use this notion of accountability in persons when I'm analyzing an interview with a 12-year-old girl, Nora. At the time of the interview, she is going to school in the 7th grade in Oslo, Norway. She lives in an inner city neighborhood in a family of Turkish descent, and the family members therefore are handling issues that pertain to Muslim religion and cultural traditions in a multicultural context where Norwegianness, whatever that means, has the hegemony, because the hegemony doesn't have to explain itself to in the same manner. We call that place East Meadow. And when in the interview, Nora tells about herself, carefully answering the questions asked about her morning routines, the immigration history of her family, and her own participation in the Quran school for girls in the weekend. The first time she introduced the topic herself, she said, "I play football." There is no doubt in my mind, who is reading the interview afterwards, that this is a personalized statement about herself. It's not just a report of an activity. She explained how she joins the boys in the football game in every break in the school day. Football has recently become her after-school activity as well. Here she is exercising with a group of other girls. She talks about what gave her this preference for playing football. Furthermore, she explains how she has to balance her own wish to involve herself in football with the kinds of reactions she encounters from others when she does so. In this moment when she says, "I play football," she is definitely engaged in the play, but also in telling about herself as a player. From that moment on, it is as if she understands what is the point in this interview, that this reports from episodes in her life that make up her everyday life is not just a report, but it is a way of being in the world. That's played out in East Meadow, but also is played out in the dialogue with the interviewer. A conversation that was up to that moment somewhat repetitive about what she did first and what she did then, would take on the quality of an intersubjective affair. We, the interviewers, are trying to find out more about how children go from 12 to 14, thus leaving their childhood behind and take up life as a young person in a multicultural context in Norway. Nora is on her way to do just that. In Nora's case, "I play football" is not just a description of one of the activities she's involved in. She refers to explicitly, but mostly implicitly, about her personal feelings about whom she is and who she would like to become. Within this domain of football, she is trying to find a place for herself. She is eager to practice in order to improve her skills, and she expects to find companions there. She describes her extensive efforts to find football activities that are suitable for her. From this subjective position, she aims at being a young female soccer player in East Meadow. To be a professional, preferably in UK, is her long-term goal. And you understand she doesn't know much about female football playing in UK. But that's not the point here. At the age of 12, playing football is how she would like to account for her way of growing up. She wants to accomplish something for herself through it, and she likes to be seen as a football player by other people. Throughout the interview with Nora, it's possible to follow how she relates to other cultural expectations as to how you should behave as a young girl. There are other expectations that she can reject or avoid because she's a female soccer player in East Meadow. She is not, for example, into changing her way of dressing according to a more teenage-like fashion. Her domain of development doesn't lie there, even though she is fully aware of that it is an important thing for many girls. For her, jeans, sweatshirts and sneakers are what she prefers. As long as she is practicing football, she can justify this way of dressing herself as well. This is her preferred activity because it gives her space for resistance and thus a position from which she can account for herself and the way she is directing her efforts. In reading and rereading the interview afterwards, it became clear to me that she's engaged to find alliances in school and in her family. Time doesn't allow me to go into details about that, but let me just mention she thinks about herself as the bossy older sister who has an alliance with the father and therefore can reject influences from the mother and the mother's sisters. But what she's working at is something that makes it possible for her to be at the same time just ordinary and very exceptional. And it's this tension about being very ordinary and just ordinary and very exceptional that's driving her. But just now I will return to me claiming, as I said, I'm a psychologist. This piece of information is not just about my background. I'm also trying to convey to you that it says more than just what I regularly do. It's about my engagement when I turn to cultural and historical theories. So what I would like to discuss with you today after this panel, under this headline of advancement, is how to get at the right kind of data material. How to get at the kind of data material that would engage us as researchers along this pathway. That is, some kind of data material that also give the researcher a chance to comprehend how persons draw upon contemporary history and culture in the making of themselves. How to build up an interaction in the here and now about something that took place in the life of the person. Both the interviewer and the person are trying to give sense to what they are doing together. Namely, focus on verbal representations and emotional conveyance of what are coming out of experiences in the person's life world. His or her way of configuring them in reoccurring pattern and in new patterns as well. So I will share with you some of my experiences from setting up interaction with a set of young people one by one in the format of an interview, which will suit such a purpose of understanding the ways in which the person in question is at the one and the same time a cultural production and a producer of culture. I call it here the live mode interview. So let me use some more minutes or so to briefly introduce this format of interviewing people when you would like to understand where they are and what they are doing in the psychological sense. This includes how their awareness of trends in contemporary history and their access to cultural tools and habits matter to them, and how they, when they are proceeding with their lives, are also making history and maintaining or challenging cultural order. Live mode interview follow all episodes in a day from morning to night. It's a conversation that's designed for collecting information about the situations and social practices of everyday life. It will cover events and routines throughout the cyclical, reoccurring format of the running time. Usually it is a day, and we anchor it in the actual yesterday, not a general day, but the actual yesterday. But in some studies and in some interviews, we had also used the reoccurring cyclical format of a week. And you could, of course, also use a year. The request to the persons who get interviewed is to learn about their lives, guide me through your day. And as I said, to draw on the particular yesterday as a starting point. Engaged probing opens up for actual social interactions anchored in time and place, and all kinds of accounts for how come things happen as they do. The rationale and the procedures for this live mode interview have been developed by me and the researchers that I collaborate with through a series of theoretical related studies about family lives, childcare, and the development of children and young people. This format for interviewing is not searching for its ultimate standardized version. And I really hope that no one will ever refer to it by the abbreviation LNI. Each study made its own detours. It's rather a set of ideas for getting to know the subjects in time and place, and a spectre of conversational habits and way of questioning that we have found usual in the particular cases. For it's all about the organization of events in time, the running time and the sequence of events from the moment you wake up in the morning until you are falling asleep in the evening. It's an organizational axis for the conversation. To say that it is an organizational axis is that at every point in time of the yesterday, you can take long detours. And you can talk about what's ordinary, what's deviate, what's special, what's regular, what's on your mind, what's going on. Be my guide to the specifics of your life. Has it always been like this? What about foresights? What about hindsights? But you can also return back, and last time we took off, you were in the bathroom in the morning. Can we go back there and see what happens next? In an hour or two, it's possible to map the full spectrum of situation and relationships, or to bring attention to some events, some kind of targeted experiences, relationships more than others. For example, just now I'm supervising a thesis where the PhD candidate are interviewing young girls with the habit of cutting their skin. And of course that will make some of the situations where they are cutting their skins, but also the situations where they are not cutting their skins, to attention about what's on their mind, what's going on. In any case, the reference, what we are talking about, stays with the person we are interviewing. And the interviewer can be curious, because since situations are coming up again and up again and up again, you get the chance to pose the same question or the similar question about similar things over and over and over again, to get more access to all the tensions, all the variations, not the conclusive characters of these experiences, but what's ongoing, what's contested, what's hoped for, what are you trying to deviate from. Following in the footsteps of the persons where he or she is carrying me, and still be able to bring them back to themselves in the here and now of the actual yesterday. For children and young people like Nora, handling the task of getting bigger, of growing up, I will learn about that. For adults, for parents, I learn about how they organize and carry out caring chores in regular way in a life mode that also consists of other responsibilities and other inclinations than just being a caregiver. From the very beginning, I'm trying not to take the background information first. You know, all these interviews when we say, I will just start with asking you for some background information. I would rather prefer, where were you when you wake up yesterday morning? Who were there? Where were they? And with that sort of bringing them to actual places and times, it's possible to do it also with 5-year-olds. We have some tricks there for the 5-year-olds. It's nice to be there in their room and ask them about what happened yesterday morning when they wake up in this place. And when they are telling about where they put their clothes on, and if that was in the bathroom, we can go to the bathroom and they can explain, show and tell what's happening and what they think of it. So, believe it or not, but we are able to make every 5-year-old into a creative artist when it comes to accounting for his or her own life. You should not think of this way of organizing a research interview as a way of recording what's there in the objective sense. Neither is it a point to create a report about activities and actors. Rather, it's a way to pay special attention to, yes, to evoke the active and generative character of emotions and motivations for the genesis of psychological subjective systems underway. So let me end this introduction by declaring I have come to think of the interview as the privileged way to get to psychological knowledge. Not that kind of interview where the informant is answering my or the psychologist's set of questions according to a list. I hate the expression of conducting a semi-structured interview, which I really think says nothing at all. But I like the kind of interview where we have established a reference to a point in time and a place in the respondent's life, and I can ask questions like, what was going on? What would happen then? What was on your mind? Or let's go back to where we were. It is as if the distinction between observations and interviewing, being there and telling about it, is blurred. But it's important that you keep the reference to the yesterday, because otherwise you will have more general inclinations which you are not that interested in, unless they are coming out of a specific reference to an actual episode that they have the first-hand access to and which they can remember fairly well. I think this privilege for the interview follows from the combination that you can draw on the one side the interviewed person as observer and as participant, and there is no split then between inner and outer aspect of being there and doing that. All kind of tensions about what is and what should be or could be are there and will be handled effectively in one way or another. An interview is a conjoined configuration of the experiences of the person in ways that allows the interviewer to understand what's going on in the life and also what's going on in the mind of that person. The interviewer's declared interest in comprehension is a way to bring the person in question also to understand himself or herself, from the inside out and from the outside in. It's to bring cultural categories of identity and attention in the ways that they are relevant for belonging and becoming. And here again a reminder for the discussion I would like to invite you into. What do you think could be the relevant kind of data material? I'm interested in both when you move from some kind of theoretical guidance to actual procedure for collecting a material, something that you think is worthy of being given a second look. But I will also be interested in hearing from you the other way around, from experiences of how you get at something that is catching your interest because it seems to be relevant and illuminating to your theoretically informed principles. So that was what I would like to share with you.